It was March 27, 1977, at 5:06 in the afternoon. The sky at Tenerife-Los Rodeos International Airport was supposed to be just another stop for people heading to the Canary Islands, but on the tarmac sat a Boeing 747-206B, registration PH-BUF. This plane had been flying for 21,195 hours since it was built in 1971. There were 248 people on that plane, and they were all ready to get where they were going. You have to understand what it's like in a cabin like that. It's always a mix of excitement for a vacation and the usual impatience of travel. But that afternoon, everything changed in a heartbeat. The collision was devastating. 248 souls were on board, and there were 0 survivors. Not one person made it out alive. 248 lives lost in a single moment. It's hard to wrap your head around. How could a massive plane designed to connect the world become a place of total loss in seconds? Why did a routine flight turn into something nobody could have imagined? Can so many systems and human choices fail at the exact same time? And why does the memory of this day still haunt everyone who knows the story? I'm Captain James Harlow, and I've spent 28 years in the cockpit trying to understand how things go wrong when everything should be going right. Welcome aboard. We're not here to judge, but to look at what actually happened that day. We need to talk about the people on that flight and the reality of that afternoon in Tenerife. When we talk about a machine like the Boeing 747-206B, we're talking about the pride of the fleet back in 1971. This specific aircraft, bearing the registration PH-BUF, was built by Boeing to be the backbone of international travel. It was a massive piece of engineering, with a serial number of 20400/157. By March that year, it had logged 21,195 hours in the air. That's a lot of time spent crossing oceans and continents. It was a workhorse for KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, a company that prides itself on precision and tradition. Let me tell you who these people were before they boarded that flight. We had 248 souls on board, and every single one of them had a story, a family, and a destination. Picture the scene at the airport. It wasn't just a flight, it was a connection between worlds. The airline was operating out of Tenerife-Los Rodeos International Airport, heading for Las Palmas Airport de Gran Canaria. Back then, the industry was different. We didn't have the digital safeguards we rely on today. We relied on the guys in the cockpit, the pilots. While the specific names of the crew weren't included in the official report, a 102/1977, I can tell you about the pressure they were under. These men were seasoned veterans of the sky. They were trained to handle the heavy, complex systems of a jumbo jet, but even the best training gets tested when the environment turns against you. The training they received was rigorous, involving thousands of hours of flight time. These pilots were expected to be calm under pressure, to make split-second decisions that would keep hundreds of people safe. They were responsible for those 248 lives. They'd worked their way up through the ranks, starting on smaller planes, before taking the controls of the 747. They were masters of their craft, yet they were human. They felt the same fatigue and stress as anyone else. Here's the thing about flying back then. The technology was impressive, but the interface between the pilot and the machine was manual and heavy. When you sit in that seat, you're not just a passenger of the plane. You're the one pulling the control column to move the nose of that massive structure. You're the one talking to the ground, trying to map out a path through the air. These pilots were dealing with a complex flight deck that required constant focus. They had to manage everything from engine performance to navigation without the advanced satellite tools we have now. 248 people boarded that plane, expecting to land in Las Palmas. They were families, business travelers, and vacationers. Every one of them was accounted for on the manifest. When the investigation by the NTSB, the folks tasked with figuring out exactly why things fell apart, was completed, the gravity of the situation became clear. There were no survivors. It's a sobering thought, to go from a routine takeoff to total loss in an instant. The investigation report. A102/1977 laid out the facts, but it could never truly capture the weight of what was lost that afternoon. It wasn't just a technical failure or a mechanical glitch. It was a moment where the human element met a set of circumstances that nobody saw coming. That's why we still talk about it today. We have to. Because the only way to honor those people is to learn from what happened. You have to understand the atmosphere at Tenerife-Los Rodeos that day. It wasn't a typical day for flying. The airport was packed with extra traffic because of a bomb threat at Las Palmas, which meant planes were diverted to this smaller regional airport. It was chaotic. And the weather began to turn. A thick, rolling fog started creeping over the runway. This fog wasn't light mist. It was the kind that swallows a plane whole. Visibility dropped to near zero. Pilots were struggling just to see the taxiway markings on the ground. The crew of the KLM flight was under immense pressure. They were concerned about their crew duty time, the legal limit on how long a pilot can work before they have to stop. If they didn't take off soon, they'd be forced to cancel and leave everyone stranded. That sense of urgency is a dangerous thing in a cockpit. It clouds your judgment. You start to push when you should be waiting. That's exactly what started to happen. They were trying to get that massive Boeing 747 moving through a maze of taxiways that were never designed to hold so many wide-body jets at once. Everything was happening over the radio, and the radio was clogged. Multiple planes were trying to talk to the tower at the same time. The English being used wasn't always perfectly clear. There was a moment when the cockpit crew believed they had clearance to take off. They'd turned the plane around and lined it up on the runway. They were pushing the power forward. The engines, those massive Pratt & Whitney engines, started to roar. The plane began to accelerate. Imagine the sensation in that cockpit. You're in a thick blanket of white fog. You can't see more than a few hundred feet in front of you, and you're hurtling down a runway that you hope is clear. They weren't alone on that runway. There was another massive jet coming towards them, moving in the opposite direction. The pilots on the KLM plane were focused on their instruments and their goal of getting into the air. They were moving at high speed, probably around 150 miles per hour. They reached the point where they needed to rotate, when you pull the control column to lift the nose wheel off the ground. The captain pulled the control column, trying to force the nose up to climb. He knew something was wrong. He could see the lights of the other plane emerging from the fog. He tried to yank the plane into the air earlier than planned. He was essentially trying to jump over the other aircraft. It was a desperate, split-second attempt to avoid collision. The plane did lift, but it was too little and too late. The belly of the KLM jet made contact with the top of the other aircraft. The sound must have been something nobody who was there could ever forget. A crunching, tearing sound of metal on metal. After the initial hit, the plane suffered a massive structural failure. It hit the ground hard. It wasn't a landing, it was a total breakdown of the machine. The wing ripped away. The plane disintegrated, and fires started to spread rapidly. It was an inferno. There was no time for anyone to react. The fuel tanks ruptured, and in seconds, the entire area was consumed by flames. Think about those 248 people. They were sitting there just moments ago, waiting for the flight to end so they could start their vacation. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was all gone. There were 0 survivors. Not a single person walked away from that wreckage. When the NTSB finished their investigation, they found that poor visibility, radio congestion, and intense pressure to stay on schedule created a perfect storm. People often ask me if there was one single thing that caused this. There never is. It's always a chain of small events, each one leading to the next. The fog hid the other plane. The radio confusion meant the tower didn't know the KLM jet was moving. The pilot's desire to beat the clock pushed him to start the takeoff run before he had definitive clearance that the runway was clear. It's a haunting reality. We trained for years to avoid these exact scenarios, yet here we are talking about a day when everything that could possibly go wrong did go wrong. The investigators looked at the flight data and the cockpit voice recordings. They tried to understand the headspace of the crew. They found that the captain was a very experienced man, very respected in the industry. But even the best pilots can fall victim to what we call get-home-itis, that internal drive to get the job done and get home, even if it means cutting a corner or ignoring a gut feeling that says to wait. It's a human trait, but in a machine that weighs hundreds of tons, it's a trait that carries a massive cost. I've spent my career looking at these reports, And every time I read about the final moments of this flight, I think about the silence that must have followed the impact. It's a heavy, terrible kind of silence. The investigation report A-102/1977 serves as a permanent record of that day, but it can't convey the loss of those 248 lives. Each of them was a person with a life, a family, and a future that ended on a foggy runway in Spain. We talk about it because we have to make sure the system is better, that communication is clearer, and that the pressure to be on time never outweighs the need to be safe. It's the most important lesson in aviation. You wait, you verify, you check again, and if you're not sure, you don't move. Because once you start that takeoff roll, you're committed. There's no turning back. And on that day, that commitment led to the end of everything for everyone on board. One moment you're sitting in a seat, and the next, you're part of history in the most tragic way possible. Look at the sheer, terrifying physics of what happened in those final seconds. The KLM Boeing 747 was already moving at nearly 155 miles per hour when the crew realized they weren't alone on that runway. The captain pulls back on the control column with everything he has. He's trying to force the nose up, hoping to clear the obstacle he sees emerging from the fog. The engines are at full throttle, screaming against the air. It's a desperate, violent surge of power. The plane is heavy, filled with fuel and passengers, and it doesn't want to lift off the ground. The crew is staring into a wall of white. Then, the collision. It's not like the movies. It's a sudden, sickening jolt that vibrates through the entire airframe. The bottom of their fuselage strikes the top of the other aircraft. The sound is a deafening metallic screech that cuts through the roar of the engines. Everything inside the cabin shifts instantly. Objects turn into projectiles. People are thrown against their seats as the massive structure begins to break apart. It's a total, chaotic loss of control. The kinetic energy is just too high. The wing tears away, and the plane starts to slide across the tarmac on its belly, grinding through the concrete like a blade. Everything is spinning. The fuel lines rupture. The fire begins to race through the fuselage faster than anyone can think. It's a wall of heat and smoke that swallows the entire cabin in one breath. The lights go out. The silence that follows the initial crash is replaced by the roar of the inferno. You might wonder if there was any chance to save the situation, if the crew could have pulled off some miracle maneuver. Here's the thing. They were out of time and out of room. The distance between the realization of the danger and the actual impact was measured in a few heartbeats. Physics is a cruel master in aviation. Once that mass of metal is moving that fast, you can't just stop it or veer away. The pilots did the only thing they knew how to do, which was to try and pull the nose up to clear the path. But when you're already in the takeoff roll, you're committed. There's no aborting once you hit that speed. It wasn't a lack of skill or bravery. It was a simple, brutal fact that the plane couldn't defy the laws of motion. They were already too deep into the takeoff, and the fog made it impossible to see the danger until it was sitting on the runway in front of them. The window for any recovery, for any maneuver, had already closed before they even saw the lights. The moments after the impact were a blur of confusion and absolute tragedy. The rescue crews at the airport weren't prepared for an event of this magnitude. When they arrived, they were met with a scene that defied belief. The fire was so intense that it was nearly impossible to get close to the wreckage. Families waiting for their loved ones in Las Palmas were left in total uncertainty for hours, not knowing that the worst had already happened. The NTSB investigators arrived later to start the long, painful process of piecing together the wreckage. They had to sift through the charred remains of the flight deck and the passenger cabin to understand what happened. They looked for the black boxes, the flight data recorders, to see exactly what the pilots were doing and what they were hearing in those last few moments. The scale of the loss was overwhelming. 248 people, gone in a heartbeat. It was the start of a massive, complex investigation that would change the way airports handle ground traffic and communication forever. Nobody on that runway that day expected to be part of history. They were just travelers, and for them, the world stopped turning in the middle of a foggy afternoon in Spain. It's a haunting, heavy reality that stays with you long after you look at the facts. Every single person on that manifest had a life, a family, and a destination, And all of that was erased by a series of events that nobody saw coming. We study this not to blame, but to make sure the system is better, so that the silence we feel when we think about those 248 souls is not for nothing. That's the weight we carry in this industry. First, we have to talk about the communication breakdown. In the cockpit, you're constantly listening for specific words that give you permission to move or fly. On that afternoon, the language used between the flight crew and the tower wasn't always as clear as it needed to be. They were using a mix of standard English and phrases that were ambiguous enough to be dangerous. The crew thought they had the green light to start their takeoff roll, but the tower was still coordinating other traffic in that heavy fog. It's a classic case of confirmation bias. When you're under pressure to leave, your brain tends to hear exactly what you want to hear. The captain was focused on that departure, and when he heard the tower say things that sounded like a clearance, he took it as a green light. He didn't double-check. He didn't wait for absolute certainty. He just pushed the power forward. When you're in a cockpit, silence or vague words are not a go-ahead. If you're not 100% sure, you hold your position. But that day, the pressure to get those 248 people out of there was just too high. Second, let's look at the massive issue of situational awareness. That's just a fancy way of saying you need to know exactly where your plane is and where everyone else is at all times. In that thick, rolling fog, that awareness was basically zero. The airport wasn't designed for the amount of traffic it was handling that day. It was a secondary location, a backup plan because of an earlier bomb threat at the primary destination. The taxiways were crowded, and the visibility was so poor that the pilots couldn't see the other aircraft sitting on the runway ahead of them. They were basically flying blind. Imagine driving your car in a parking lot where the fog is so thick you can't see your own hood. That's what those pilots were dealing with, but at jet speed. They relied on their instruments, but those instruments couldn't tell them if another plane was directly in their path. It was a perfect storm of bad timing and poor visibility. They were moving at high speed, and by the time the other aircraft appeared in their lights, it was already too late. They had no time to react because they didn't know the danger existed until they were hitting it. Third, we have to talk about the human factor, specifically the pressure of the clock. This is something every pilot knows, but it can be a silent killer. The crew was approaching their duty time limits, the legal hours you're allowed to be in the pilot seat before you have to stop and rest. If they didn't take off, they'd be stuck there, and they'd have to deal with a lot of frustrated passengers. That stress, that urge to just get the job done and get home, is a powerful thing. It can make you take risks you'd never dream of taking under normal conditions. It pushes you to skip a step or be less thorough than you should be. You start thinking, everything will probably be fine, so let's just go. But in aviation, probably being fine isn't good enough. You need to be sure. That pressure to beat the clock clouded their judgment and led them to start that takeoff roll before the runway was actually clear. Such a simple human desire, the need to finish the work and go home, could lead to such a massive tragedy. It's hard to wrap your head around, but that's the reality of the business. It's not always a mechanical failure. Sometimes, it's just the person in the seat, trying to do the right thing, but doing it in a way that leads to the worst possible outcome. We're all human and we all make mistakes, but in a 747, those mistakes cost everything. It's a tough lesson, but one we have to keep learning. Nobody saw this coming, and that's why it changed everything we do in the cockpit today. We learned to be more patient, to demand clearer communication, and to never let the clock tell us when it's safe to fly. That's the only way to honor what happened to those 248 souls. You wait for the truth, you verify the path, and you never move until you're certain. Looking back at Report A-102/1977 from the NTSB, it's clear that this day forced the entire industry to grow up overnight. Before this happened, communication was loose and often left to interpretation. After that afternoon, the aviation world adopted mandatory standardized phraseology. No more casual chatter or ambiguous requests for takeoff. If a pilot isn't explicitly told they're cleared to fly, they stay put. Period. That shift in language, known as standard radio telephony, became the law of the skies. It eliminated the guesswork that turned a simple taxiway into a death trap. We also saw a total overhaul of the way crews interact in the cockpit. This led to the development of Crew Resource Management, or CRM. It's a system that teaches pilots to challenge each other, to speak up if they see something wrong, and to stop the ego from getting in the way of safety. It changed the hierarchy in the cockpit, ensuring that the first officer feels just as empowered as the captain to say stop when things feel off. It took such a massive loss to realize that the person in the left seat needed to listen to the person in the right seat. It's a change that has saved countless lives since, turning the cockpit into a team environment rather than a one-man show. It's impossible to think about those 248 souls without feeling the weight of it all. These were mothers, fathers, and children heading off for a break, never knowing that their destination would be etched into the history books for all the wrong reasons. Every time I step into a cockpit, I carry that memory with me. It's a reminder that we're just human beings operating machines, and the margin for error is razor thin. We owe it to them to keep asking the hard questions and to never get comfortable, because safety isn't a status. It's a choice you make every single day. I don't have a massive studio or a team of researchers behind me. This channel is just me, trying to make sure these stories are told the right way. If you found this reflection valuable, please consider hitting that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this video to others who care about these stories as much as we do. If you want to support the channel directly and help me keep digging into these reports, consider becoming a member. It keeps the lights on and the research going. I'm curious to hear your take on this. If you could have been in that tower that day, what's the one thing you would have done differently to stop that collision from ever happening? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Thanks for listening and stay safe out there.